Cool. So I have the Arabian Nights, translated by Hussein Hadavi. And this is based on the 14th century manuscript edited by Muhsin Mahdi. I have here Don Quixote. Don Quixote was made in two parts. The first part was made in 1606 by Cervantes, and then Cervantes also made in 1615 and published in 1616 part 2, which is 10 times longer as the first part. This is by Cervantes. And then finally, we have my favorite, Julius Caesar, The Gallic War. How Caesar, his autobiography, and how he basically took over, or he Romanized Europe. Yeah. So I'm going to start by reading Julius Caesar's Commentaries, and then I'm going to go back to Don Quixote, and then I'm going to go to Arabian Nights, and then that'll be it. Okay. I mentioned earlier that the enemy's first assault had routed our cavalry and the light infantry which had accompanied it. When these forces of ours returned to camp, they had ran right up against the enemy advance and again tried to flee elsewhere. From the main entrance gate, on the crest of the hill, the orderlies had seen our men cross the river victorious, and had then gone out in search of plunder. But when they saw the enemy moving about in our camp, they took to their heels and fled. At that moment, a roar of confusion went up from the men marching with the baggage train, and frightened soldiers started to flee in all directions. All this served to terrify the cavalry of the Treveri, who have a reputation for outstanding bravery among the Gauls. They had sent out by their people as reinforcements had come to Caesar. When, however, they saw the enemy swarming all over our camp, our legions, hard pressed and on the point of being surrounded, our orderlies, cavalry, slingers, and Numidians spread out and scattered, fleeing in all directions. And then they abandoned hope for our cause and made their way home. The Romans were beaten. They announced to their fellow citizens, the Romans were overcome. The Nervi had taken possession of their camp and their baggage. After his words of encouragement to the 10th, Caesar made his way to the right flank. There he saw that his soldiers were hard pressed. Because their standards were crowded together, the men of the 12th were packed so close that they obstructed one another in the fighting. All the centurions of the 4th cohort were dead. The standard bearer was slain, the standard lost. But all but a few centurions from the rest of the cohorts were wounded or dead. Among the casualties was a senior centurion called Publius Sextius Baculus, a man of immense courage who was suffering from numerous serious wounds. He could no longer stand upright, and the rest of the men were weakening. Some of those at the rear were leaving the battle and retreating to avoid missiles, while the enemy did not slacken, but pressed up the hill in front and continued to attack on both flanks. Caesar realized that the outcome rested on a knife edge, that there was no hope of reinforcements. So he snatched a shield from one of the soldiers at the rear. He had come out without his own shield and made his way to the front line. There, he called upon the centurions by name and encouraged the men, ordering them to advance and open ranks so they could use their swords more easily. His coming gave the men fresh hope and heartened them. Each one was eager of his own accord to do well in his commander's sight, even at great personal risk, and the enemy assault was checked a little. Caesar now saw that the 7th Legion too, which had taken up a position beside the 12th, was being hard-pressed by the enemy. He ordered the military tribunes to close their legions up gradually, wheel about, and attack the enemy. By this means, since they could all support one another and need not fear being attacked by the enemy from behind, they began to resist with greater daring and to fight more bravely. Meanwhile, the soldiers from the 2 legions, which had been at the rear of the column to guard the baggage, heard of the battle. They sped forward and came into the enemy view on top of the hill. Titus Labienus, who had taken over the enemy camp and from his vantage point saw what was happening in our camp. He sent the 10th Legion to our men's assistance. When the men of the 10th discovered from the fleeing cavalry and orderlies where the fighting was, and the extent of the danger which now threatened the camp, the legions and their commander, they left nothing undone in terms of speed. Their arrival transformed our fortunes, so much so that our men, even those who lay wounded, supported themselves on their shields and began to fight afresh. The orderlies now observed that it was the nervi who were afraid, and weaponless as they were, they charged upon the armed enemy. So too the cavalry tried to wipe out the shame of its desertion by fighting everywhere in an attempt to outdo the legionnaires. The enemy, however, even at this critical moment, showed such determination in their bravery that when those in front rank had fallen, the men behind them stood upon the slain and continued to fight from on top of the corpses. When they were overthrown, the pile of bodies grew higher, while the survivors used the heap as a vantage point for throwing missiles at our men. Or catching their spears and throwing them back. Not without good reason were they judged to be men of enormous bravery, for they had dared to cross a very wide river, climb its steep banks, and advance on extremely difficult ground. The nervi's courage had made light of these obstacles. When the battle was over, the name and fighting strength of the nervi were almost wiped out. We mentioned earlier that the elders were gathered together in inlets and marshes, along with the women and children. When news came of the battle, they assumed that nothing stood in the way of the victors, and that for the vanquished, nothing was secure. So all of the survivors agreed to send envoys to Caesar, and surrendered to him, describing the disaster which had befallen them. The Nervian envoys declared that they had been reduced from 600 senators to 3, from 60,000 men capable of active service to a mere 500. Caesar was eager to preserve their safety and to be seen to exercise clemency towards the wretched people who were pleading with him. He ordered them to confine themselves to their own territories and towns, and commanded their neighbors to refrain from doing the Nervi and their people harm or injury. We described that the Aduatsuchi above, they were on their way to assist the Nervi in full force, when the news of this battle made them give up their march and return home. They abandoned all their towns and strongholds and brought all their property to one town, which had superb natural defenses. All along its circumference, it presented sheer cliffs and heights, which at one spot left a gently sloping approach, no more than 200 feet wide. This the Aduatuci had strengthened by a high double wall and were even now putting heavy rocks and sharpened stakes along its length. The Aduatuci were descendants of those Cimbri and Tuetoni, who, when marching into our province and Italy, had left all the cattle and baggage they could not drive or carry with them on this side of the Rhine. They left a guard, 6,000 of their own men, to protect it. Following the destruction of the main force, these men were harassed by neighboring peoples, sometimes attacking, sometimes defending. Eventually, peace was made by common consent, and they selected this place to settle in. As soon as our army arrived at the Aduatuci, began making frequent sallies from the town and skirmishing with our men. Later, when they were shut in by a rampart 4.5 miles in length, with numerous forts along it, they remained in the town. Movable shelters were drawn up, and earthwork built, and when the Aduatuci saw a siege tower constructed in the distance, at first they stood on the wall, mocking and jeering that such a large apparatus was being put together so far off. What hands, what strength were men of such puny stature relying on to move this huge and heavy tower against their wall? For the main part, Gauls were very tall and hold our slighter build in contempt. But when they saw the tower being moved and coming close to the walls, the sight of it was so unusual and unexpected that it prompted them to send envoys to Caesar to ask for peace. Then envoys spoke to the effect that in their opinion, the Romans had divine help in waging war, to enable them to move such tall structures forward so quickly. And so they declared they surrendered themselves and all their possessions to the Romans' control. They begged and pleaded for only one favor, if perhaps his clemency and mercy, of which they had heard from others, were to prompt Caesar to spare them, not to be deprived of their weapons. Almost all their neighbors were hostile and looked on their courage with an unfriendly eye. The Aduatuci could not protect themselves against these people without weapons. They would rather endure any fate at the hands of the Roman people if brought to such a pass than be tortured and killed by peoples among whom they had once reigned supreme. Caesar answered them that he would spare their state more because this would accord with his habitual practice than because of their merit. If they surrendered, before battering ram touched the wall. There could, however, be no formal surrender unless they gave up their weapons. Instead, he would do for them what he had done for the Nervi, and would order the neighboring peoples not to harm subjects of the Roman people. His offer was reported back to the Aduatuci, and they agreed to obey. They threw a large number of weapons down from the wall into the ditch in front of the town. The piles of arms were almost as high as the wall and mound. Even so, it was revealed later that about a third of their weapons had been concealed and kept in the town. They had opened their gates, and for that day enjoyed peace. When night fell, Caesar gave orders to the gates to be closed, and the soldiers to leave the town, to prevent the soldiers doing the inhabitants any harm by night. But the Aduatuci were acting on a predetermined plan. It seemed in the belief that after the surrender of our men would withdraw their guards, or at least keep watch on rather less carefully. They equipped themselves with the weapons they had kept concealed, and with shields which, as the pressure of time demanded, were made in haste, of bark or wicker, covered with hides. At the third watch, they suddenly burst out of the town in full strength and attacked where the climb up to our defense works was least steep. As Caesar had already ordered, a fire signal was immediately given. The men ran to assemble from the nearest forts. The enemy fought as fiercely as brave men might be expected to when clinging to their last hope of safety. On difficult ground against Romans throwing missiles at them from the rampart and towers, when their only hope of survival lay in courage alone. About 4,000 men were killed, and the rest forced back into the town. Next day, the gates were broken open, and for there was no one to defend them. Caesar sent our soldiers inside and sold everything in the town in one lot. The buyers reported him a sale numbering 53,000 people. At the same time, Publius Crassus, whom Caesar had sent with a legion against the Veneti, Venelli, Ossismi, Curosolite, Usubi, Ulersi, and the Ridones, the coastal states beside the ocean, sent him news that all those states had been brought under the power and dominion of the Roman people. Once this action was over, the whole of Gaul was pacified. The fame of this war spread among the barbarians and was so impressive that the peoples living on the other side of the Rhine sent envoys to Caesar. They promised to give him hostages and to obey his command. He was, however, in a hurry to reach Italy and the Illyricum, and so told the embassies to return to him at the start of the following summer. Then he took the legions to their winter quarters in the lands of Cornutus, Andes, and Turones, and the other states near to the area where he had been campaigning. He himself set out for Italy. Because of these achievements reported in a letter from Caesar, a thanksgiving of 15 days was decreed. This had never been granted to anyone before. Cool, so that was the end of the second book of Caesar's Commentaries. That was the end of the second book of Julius Caesar's Commentaries. And we have, so it's the second book, 57 BC. So 57 years before Christ was born, this was written. Consuls Publius Cornelius Lentulus Spinther, Quintus Caecilius Metellus Nepos, defeats for the Belgic people. So this was the defeat of Belgium during the Gallic War. Cool, that was 20 minutes and a half of reading. I am going to make a coffee, and maybe I'll read some more, or I'll make some more tourism videos for this beautiful island.